And I've challenged him to come forward and be a man, be a man, be a man, and tell everybody the truth about what happened in Natalie Wood's death right now.
So tonight we're going to be talking about some recent statements made by Christopher Walken regarding the night that Natalie Wood drowned. Tell us a little bit about this, Sam, for people who maybe haven't seen this yet or haven't been following it.
I was looking at the interview that I did with Marilyn Wayne that was viewed by so many thousands of people. I think the last time I saw it, it was over 160,000. I was looking at that interview because I was curious about something that I asked her about. And in the process, up popped this video relating to Christopher Walken. And the title of the video is Christopher Walken Finally Breaks His Silence on Natalie Wood's Death. Well, you can imagine that I was very anxious to listen to that and see what we had from Christopher Walken in 2024.
Yes, absolutely.
Well, after I looked at the video and shook my head, I thought, I think I need to ask Carrie if maybe we could do an interview. I need to know how many times Christopher Walken has lied about what happened that night since 1981, since it happened. He was interviewed roughly about 2 hours after Natalie's body was fished out of the Pacific Ocean. And this is what was in the notes of Investigator Hamilton that Christopher Walken said at 10:50 a.m. on Sunday, November the 29th, 1981. Saturday night went out, had drinks. I had a lot. She can't drink. Had two. RJ and I had small beef.
The small beef.
So breaking a wine bottle in your face is a small beef after someone accuses you of wanting to have sex with their wife. RJ and I had a small beef. I ran out the door, came back, and she went down to her room. RJ and I made up, hugging each other. Didn't hear boat start. I thought she went to bed. I thought she thought we were a bunch of assholes. I think DeVerne noticed Dinghy gone. And then he says, we looked for Dinghy, then we looked for her. Okay? So what he told the investigators 2 hours after Natalie's body was found was, among other things, that he helped search for Natalie when Natalie disappeared. That's what he said. We looked for the dinghy, and then we looked for her. Okay, so now the investigators go to the island, they interview people. They did a 6-minute interview of Wagner at the same time, or before they interviewed Walken. And when they finish up their so-called investigation on the island, they leave and they go back to their office and they decide they want to talk to Walken and Wagner again. So arrangements were made for the detectives to go to Walken's room at the Beverly, Wiltshire Hotel there in Los Angeles and interview him in his room with his criminal defense attorney in tow. Okay? So now it's Walken and his lawyer, and they're talking to the detectives. This is 4 days later. 4 days. Walken said, after they discovered Natalie and the dinghy were missing, they all felt she had gone ashore in the Zodiac, that's the dinghy, probably back to the restaurant. Walken then told the officials, and this is written in the notes, it didn't mean too much to him because he knew she had gone ashore the night before and stayed at Avalon. Of course, the night before, she went with Dennis DeVerne. She didn't go by herself. So, and it's back to Walken now. This is what he said. So he just went to his stateroom and went to sleep. And then Hamilton writes this in his official notes, that Walken said, slept all night. So after telling them on Sunday that he went looking for Natalie, after searching for the dinghy, he's telling them now that he was asleep and he slept all night after he went down to his room. Now, just so you'll know, I have witnesses, I have interviewed witnesses, and they're still alive, that saw Christopher Walken on the yacht when they began the search for Natalie around 2:30 to 3 a.m. that Sunday morning. Walken doesn't say anything else for a couple days, and apparently he decided he was going back to New York. Maybe he decided he needed to get out of town. So on December the 2nd, he's leaving the hotel, and a Los Angeles Times reporter asked him about allegations of an argument that were made by Dr. Thomas Noguchi during his famous press conference on Natalie Wood's death. He said there was an argument between Wagner and Walken. And this is what Walken said to the reporter, and it's in quotes. I don't remember the coroner being there. And it was the third anniversary of Natalie. He had agreed to a big interview with The Face magazine, which was a British publication. I don't know if The Face magazine is still in existence or not, but back at the time, it was a big publication. He's interviewed by a British reporter by the name of Neil Norman, and I did some research on Neil and actually reached out to him, and he communicated back with me. He had a photograph that I wanted, and I actually acquired a photograph that he had taken during the interview of Christopher Walken, and it's in my book. The article was entitled Walken Talks, okay? So, and they finally get around to Natalie's death, and Walken says this, that his silence for 3 years had been simply a silence of ignorance. And when the reporter asked what he meant by that, he said, we were all having a great weekend. Now, this is after somebody busted a wine bottle in his face and accused him of wanting to have sex with his wife. And a very, very good time, Walken added. We were not the only people having a good time. It always sounds like we were all alone on the high seas. We were actually 50 feet off the shore, which they weren't. They were probably 300 feet off the shore. In Catalina Harbor, which they weren't. They were down at the isthmus, with many, many boats around us. In Catalina Harbor, there were many, many boats, but in the isthmus, there weren't many, many boats. The weather was shitty. That part of his statement is truthful. Everybody was locked inside. There was a sort of cold drizzle. We were partying, there's no question about that. But then he said we were partying very conservatively. Then apparently Neil Norman allowed him to say what happened, and Walken said or claimed he was asleep when it happened. So if Walken was asleep when it happened, how does he know that it's an accident if he was asleep when it happened? Then Walken goes silent for 2 more years. And then he has an interview with Star magazine. And in this thing, he said the article was entitled, Natalie Wood, Wagner, and Me. Christopher Walken tells his own story of drowning. So I'm sure everybody bought it off the magazine rack when they saw that. Christopher Walken's finally going to say what happened. And he begins by saying, I wish with all my heart I could have saved her. And I say in my book, well, did he have an opportunity to save her?
Yeah.
I mean, why would you say something like that?
Yeah.
And as far as his knowledge of the events, Walken said, Natalie was tired. She wanted to go to bed. RJ and I were not having an argument. A lie, of course. It had been a very pleasant evening until, and then the article says, his voice trails off. And then it picks up a quote again where he repeats himself. But I want to stress there was no argument between RJ and me. The family was very good to me. Well, there was an argument. And so not only did he lie, he emphasized his lie when he said there wasn't an argument. There was. And Christopher Walken knows it. He goes silent again. And this time he doesn't talk to anybody until 1997. And it's an issue of Playboy magazine. They're hard to find, but I found one. The interview is really interesting because it's got a question and answer. It's got the reporter's question, and then it's got Walken's answer. And when it gets down to Natalie, after he says he doesn't really enjoy children, he was asked about the incident, and he says, there really is nothing to talk about. What happened that night, only she knows because she was alone. Now, how would he know that if he was asleep when it happened? I mean, how would he know she was alone? The evidence is, really the undisputed evidence is that the last person to see her was Robert Wagner, and it was on the back deck of the Splendor with an open swim step door that she could be pushed out of. Finally, he says, she had gone to bed before us, which is not true. And her room was at the back. Well, a room was in the back of the boat. A dinghy was bouncing against the side of the boat. Now, isn't this interesting? It just so happens that became Robert Wagner's defense, that Natalie was asleep, they were upstairs drinking and talking, and Natalie was asleep, and the dinghy was banging up against the yacht, and Natalie got up to go tighten the dinghy rope, and when she did, so that she stumbled or something and fell into the water through the swim step and drowned. That was his new defense that he put out there. So now Christopher Walken is saying a dinghy was bouncing against the side of the boat, something he'd never, ever said before. And something he knows is not the truth. He knows that. Plus, I don't know that he could hear it. And then he said, then he just launches into speculation. She probably was half asleep, and she apparently moved the boat around. She slipped and hit her head and fell in the water. Well, we have done another interview, if people would like to watch it, about the forensics, but I just want to tell you that there were 3 pathologists. They examined Natalie's skull. They examined the skin around her skull. They examined her brain. There was absolutely no trauma to that lady's head. None. The only trauma she had to her head was an abrasion on her face. An abrasion like this. Something scratched the side of her cheek. He finally says, when he was asked about an argument between he and Wagner, he tried to avoid the question 3 times. I'll give the porter credit for pushing him, for pressing him, because he asked him 3 times about it. And his final answer was, I remember saying that I didn't recall the coroner being there. If there had been anything wrong, certainly the police would have looked into it. The story I just told you is the absolute truth. Well, it's not. It's an absolute falsity. And once again, he knows that. Now, according to my knowledge, Christopher Walken has not come out and said anything in any kind of interview or anything else about the details concerning Natalie Wood's death. Not one thing. And this video doesn't do it either.
Do you think we'll ever hear Christopher Walken really tell the truth about what happened?
No, I don't think we ever will. And I think it's this reason. If we hear the truth from Christopher Walken, he's going to have to admit that he lied all these years about knowing what happened. He's going to have to admit that he heard them fighting. He's going to have to admit he stayed in his room and he didn't do anything when he heard them fighting. When he heard a violent fight, because he could hear the banging and crashing too, just like Laverne said he could hear. And he didn't do anything. Like I said, he's going to have to admit that he lied to the detectives and everyone else. And I just don't think he's got the character to do it, frankly. And secondly, I think he thinks it would tarnish his legacy as an actor, and he will never do it. I don't think he will ever tell us the truth. But, Christopher, if you're watching me, I offer you the opportunity to sit down with me and have a pleasant conversation about what you actually know concerning Natalie Wood's death. Just answer some questions for us that we've had for over 40 years, and we'll have a very interesting interview.
I often think about Wagner and Walken. Did they cross paths through the years after this? What kind of relationship did they have? What kind of interactions have they had?
That's a good question. After the Star interview, Wagner gave an interview where he said he knew that Walken went to the funeral and he was very uncomfortable with him there. Now, if something didn't happen other than Natalie accidentally drowning, why in the world would he be uncomfortable with Christopher Walken at the funeral?
Yeah.
He was always concerned that Christopher Walken was going to tell the truth. But after Walken told several lies, including the lie to try to help him with his defense about a banging dinghy, then he knew that Walken wasn't going to. The only thing that gets me, Gary, when I talk about Natalie in this book and the facts and stuff, is I just have this continual image of terrified Natalie Wood in the water, floating away from that yacht in the pitch black dark, knowing that she can't swim, cold. She's so cold she can't even speak. And she's floating out to her death.
That's heartbreaking.
It's just...
Well, thank you so much, Sam. As always, so interesting.
You're welcome, dear.
Yes.
So now let's get Dan in there real quick.
Okay.
Let me talk to him again.
Okay, let me grab him. Daniel? Hello? Let me go find him.
What's the matter? He doesn't have any clothes on?